On August 4th, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson sat in the Oval Office listening to reports of North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacking American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Within days, Congress passed a resolution giving Johnson unlimited authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. The politicians in Washington spoke of dominoes falling and the need to contain communism. They spoke of American credibility in the free world, but they didn't speak about the price tag. They didn't tell the American people that they were about to embark on the most expensive military adventure since World War II. They didn't mention that this distant war in the jungles of Vietnam would shatter the American economy, destroy the dollar's dominance, and the boom, and usher in a decade of inflation and stagnation that would fundamentally reshape American society. This is the story of how a war that America lost on the battlefield also bankrupted the nation that fought it. To understand the economic catastrophe that Vietnam became, you have to understand what America looked like before the war. In 1964, the United States was at the peak of its power. The economy was booming. Unemployment was under 4%. The stock market was climbing. American factories were producing half of the world's manufactured goods. The dollar was the undisputed global reserve currency, backed by the largest gold reserves in history. Fort Knox held over 15,000 tons of gold, more than all other nations combined. Under the Bretton Woods system established after World War II, every major currency in the world was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This meant that any foreign government could walk into the Federal Reserve with a suitcase full of dollars and demand gold in exchange. It was the foundation of American financial dominance. The world trusted the dollar because the dollar was as good as gold, and America could print dollars to buy whatever it wanted from anywhere in the world. It was an economic superpower that seemed invincible. At the same time, America was building something unprecedented at home. President Lyndon Johnson had launched the Great Society, the most ambitious domestic spending program since the New Deal. Medicare and Medicaid were created to provide health care for the elderly and the poor. The war on poverty was funding education, housing, and job training programs. Federal spending on social programs was exploding. Johnson believed that America was rich enough to afford both a war on poverty at home and a war against communism abroad. He called it guns and butter. The country could have both military strength and domestic prosperity. It was an illusion, but it was a seductive one. Johnson was terrified of appearing weak on communism. He had seen how Republicans had destroyed Democrats politically in the 1950s by accusing them of losing China. He was determined not to be the president who lost Vietnam. But he was also terrified of asking Congress and the American people to pay for the war. He knew that if he revealed the true cost, Congress would make him choose between the war and the Great Society. So he chose to lie. He hid the costs. He understated the troop levels. He claimed the war would be short, and he paid for it in the most dangerous way possible. He printed money. The escalation began slowly. In 1965, Johnson sent the first combat troops, 3,500 Marines, to Da Nang. By the end of the year, there were 200,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. By 1968, there were over 500,000. Each soldier cost approximately $50,000 per year to maintain in the field. That's not just his salary. That's his food, his ammunition, his transportation, his medical care, his equipment. Everything had to be shipped across the Pacific Ocean to Southeast Asia. The logistics were a nightmare. Vietnam had no ports that could handle massive cargo ships, no railroads to move supplies, no infrastructure. The Americans had to build everything from scratch. They built deep water ports at Cam Ranh Bay and Da Nang. They built airfields that could handle giant C-130 transport planes. They built roads, bridges, and supply depots. They built entire military cities in the jungle. The construction alone cost billions of dollars. And then there was the ammunition. The Vietnam War consumed ammunition at a rate that defied all previous calculations. American forces fired 50,000 rounds of ammunition for every enemy soldier killed. Artillery batteries would fire thousands of shells in a single night, pounding the jungle in the hope of hitting Viet Cong. The Air Force dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than were dropped in all of World War II. Over 7 million tons of explosives were rained down on Southeast Asia. Each bomb cost money to manufacture, money to transport, and money to deliver. The most expensive weapon in the American arsenal was the helicopter. Vietnam was the first helicopter war. The Bell UH-1 Huey became the iconic symbol of the conflict. These machines allowed American troops to leap over the jungle and attack from the air. But helicopters are incredibly expensive to operate. They burn fuel constantly. They require obsessive maintenance. The jungle environment, the heat, the humidity, the dust, destroyed engines, and rotor blades. A single Huey cost about $250,000 to build. The U.S. deployed thousands of them, and they were being shot down or crashing at an alarming rate. Over 5,000 helicopters were lost during the war. That's billions of dollars falling out of the sky. But the Pentagon kept ordering more. The defense contractors kept building them, and the bills kept piling up. By 1967, the war was costing $2 billion per month. That's $25 billion per year, equivalent to over $200 billion in today's money. And that was just the direct military spending. It didn't include the cost of veterans' benefits, the interest on the debt, or the economic damage caused by taking 500,000 young men out of the productive economy. But where was this money coming from? Johnson refused to raise taxes. He knew it would be political suicide. In 1967, he finally asked Congress for a modest tax increase, a 10% surcharge on income taxes, but it was too little, too late. And even this small increase was deeply unpopular. The American people were being told the war was going well. That victory was around the corner. Why did they need to sacrifice? So the government borrowed. The Treasury issued bonds to finance the war. The national debt, which had been slowly declining as a percentage of the economy since World War II, started to climb again. But borrowing wasn't enough either. The deficits were too large. The government needed cash immediately. So the Federal Reserve did what central banks do when governments can't pay their bills. They printed money. The Fed expanded the money supply to buy government bonds. This injected fresh dollars into the economy. In the short term, it allowed the government to pay for both the war and the Great Society without raising taxes. But in the long term, it was poison. Because when you print money without increasing the production of goods and services, you get inflation. And inflation was about to rip through the American economy like a wildfire. The first signs appeared in 1966. Prices started to rise. The cost of food increased. The cost of housing increased. The cost of clothing increased. At first it was subtle, just a few percentage points per year. The government dismissed it as temporary, a minor side effect of a booming economy. But the workers noticed. Their paychecks were buying less. A gallon of milk that cost 50 cents in 1965 cost 60 cents in 1968. A new car that cost $2,500 in 1965 cost $3,000 in 1968. Unions started demanding higher wages to keep up with the rising cost of living. And when they got higher wages, businesses raised prices to cover the increased labor costs. It was the beginning of the wage price spiral that would define the 1970s. But the real crisis was happening in the international financial system. Foreign governments were watching. They saw the American deficits exploding. They saw the money printing. They saw the inflation. And they started to get nervous. Under the Bretton Woods system, foreign central banks were accumulating massive amounts of dollars from trade. American consumers were buying Volkswagens from Germany, electronics from Japan, and wine from France. The dollars flowed out of the United States and into foreign bank accounts. Those foreign banks could theoretically exchange those dollars for gold at any time. As long as they trusted the dollar, they held on to the paper. But by 1968, trust was evaporating. The French were the first to call America's bluff. President Charles de Gaulle looked at the American deficits and declared that the dollar was overvalued. He accused the United States of living beyond its means, of financing its war and its domestic programs by printing paper and forcing the rest of the world to accept it. In 1965, France began converting its dollar reserves into gold. French naval ships literally sailed to New York, loaded up with gold bars from the Federal Reserve, and shipped them back to Paris. Other countries followed. Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands started redeeming dollars for gold. The gold began to flow out of Fort Knox. By 1968, the U.S. gold reserves had fallen from 15,000 tons to 10,000 tons. The drain was accelerating. If it continued, the United States would run out of gold within a few years. The entire Bretton Woods system, the foundation of American financial power, was collapsing. In March 1968, the crisis reached a breaking point. In a single week, the U.S. lost over $400 million in gold. The speculators smelled blood. They were buying gold on the private market, betting that the U.S. would be forced to devalue the dollar or abandon the gold standard entirely. The London gold market, where private investors could buy and sell gold, saw panic buying. The price of gold spiked above $40 per ounce, far above the official $35 peg. The US and European central banks tried to defend the price by selling gold into the market, but they were fighting a tidal wave. On March 17, 1968, the US and its allies closed the London gold market for 2 weeks. When it reopened, they had created a two-tier system. Governments could still exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce, but private buyers would have to pay whatever the market demanded. It was an admission that the system was breaking. The gold drain slowed, but the damage was done. The world now knew that the dollar was vulnerable. The Vietnam War was bleeding America of its gold, and there was no end in sight. Meanwhile, the war itself was becoming a political nightmare. In January 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated attack on cities across South Vietnam. Although the offensive was a military defeat for the communists, it was a psychological victory. The American public watched on television as enemy soldiers fought inside the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They had been told the war was almost won. They had been told the enemy was on the verge of collapse. Now they saw the truth. The war was unwinnable. The credibility gap, the distance between what the government said and what people could see with their own eyes, became a catastrophe. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, went on television and said the war was a stalemate. President Johnson, watching from the White House, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The political support for the war evaporated. The protests intensified, the campuses erupted, and the economy started to buckle under the strain. By 1969, inflation was over 5% per year, the highest it had been in nearly 2 decades. The stock market, which had been climbing steadily, stalled. The great post-war boom was ending. Richard Nixon, who won the presidency in 1968 on a promise to end the war, inherited an economic mess. But Nixon didn't end the war quickly. He expanded it, invading Cambodia in 1970 and intensifying the bombing campaigns. The costs continued to mount. By the time the last American troops left in 1973, the U.S. had spent over $140 billion on the war, equivalent to over $1 trillion today. But the true cost was far higher when you included veterans' benefits, interest on the debt, and the long-term economic damage. Some economists estimate the total cost of the Vietnam War at over $1 trillion in 1970s dollars, equivalent to many trillions today. But the monetary cost was just the beginning of the economic disaster. The inflation unleashed by the war spending didn't stop when the war ended. It accelerated. In 1971, facing a collapsing dollar and an economy in crisis, Nixon made a decision that would end an era. On August 15, 1971, in a televised address, he announced that the United States was closing the gold window. No longer would foreign governments be able to exchange dollars for gold. The dollar would float freely, its value determined by the market. It was the end of Bretton Woods. It was the end of the gold standard. It was the end of the post-war financial order. Nixon tried to frame it as a bold move to protect American jobs from foreign speculators. But in reality, it was an admission of defeat. The Vietnam War had drained so much gold from Fort Knox that the U.S. could no longer honor its commitments. America had printed too many dollars to pay for the war, and now the bill was coming due. The world was holding trillions of dollars, and the U.S. didn't have enough gold to redeem them. So Nixon simply refused to pay. It was the largest sovereign default in history, though it was never called that. The immediate effect was chaos in the currency markets. The dollar plummeted against other currencies. The German mark and the Japanese yen surged. American exports became cheaper, which helped some industries, but imports became much more expensive. The cost of foreign oil, foreign cars, and foreign electronics skyrocketed. And this was just the beginning of the pain. With the dollar no longer tied to gold, there was no constraint on money printing. The Federal Reserve, under pressure from politicians to keep the economy growing, expanded the money supply aggressively. Inflation, which had been bad in the late 1960s, became catastrophic in the 1970s. By 1974, inflation hit 11%. By 1979, it was 13%. A dollar in 1979 could buy less than half of what it could buy in 1969. The savings of middle-class Americans were being destroyed. Retirees on fixed incomes watched their purchasing power collapse. Workers demanded higher wages, which drove prices even higher. It was a vicious cycle. The 1970s became known as the era of stagflation, a combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation that economists had thought was impossible. The post-war boom was over. The American century was ending. The factories that had dominated the world were now uncompetitive. American steel, American cars, and American electronics were being undercut by cheaper, better products from Japan and Germany. The Rust Belt was born. As factories closed and workers were laid off unemployment, Hosey, in the 1970s, America experienced 4 recessions. The stock market stagnated. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, fell. For the first time since the Great Depression, the average American family was getting poorer, not richer. The social contract was breaking. The promise that each generation would be better off than the last was being shattered, and the American people knew who to blame. They blamed the government. They blamed the war. They blamed the elites who had lied to them about Vietnam and had destroyed the economy in the process. The distrust in government that began with the war metastasized into a broader distrust of all institutions. It contributed to the Watergate scandal, to Nixon's resignation, to the malaise that President Carter would later describe. The economic damage of Vietnam went beyond the numbers. It destroyed the confidence that had defined post-war America. But there was another cost, one that's harder to quantify, but just as real. The war consumed resources that could have been used for productive investment. The $140 billion spent on the war could have built infrastructure, funded education, or supported scientific research. Instead, it was spent on napalm, Agent Orange, and bombs that left craters in the jungle. The 500,000 young men sent to Vietnam were taken out of the workforce at the peak of their productivity. Some came back physically or psychologically damaged, and I bow to work. Over 58,000 never came back at all. That's 58,000 people who would never start businesses, never innovate, never contribute to the economy. The opportunity cost was staggering. There's also the cost of veterans' benefits. The U.S. government made a promise to the soldiers who fought. They would receive medical care, disability payments, and pensions. These costs didn't end in 1973. They continued for decades. Even today, in the 21st century, the U.S. government is still paying benefits to aging Vietnam veterans. The total cost of veterans' benefits from the Vietnam War has exceeded $200 billion and is still climbing. When you add it all up, the direct military spending, the veterans' benefits, the interest on the debt, the economic damage from inflation, the opportunity costs, the Vietnam War cost America over $2 trillion in today's dollars. And for what? The U.S. lost the war. South Vietnam fell to the communists in 1975. The dominoes that America had gone to war to prevent from falling fell anyway. Laos and Cambodia also fell to communist governments, but the sky didn't fall. The world didn't end. The domino theory turned out to be wrong. The countries of Southeast Asia that remained non-communist, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, prospered. The war had been unnecessary. The sacrifice had been for nothing. The irony is bitter. The Soviet Union, America's rival, didn't have to invade Vietnam to defeat the United States. They just had to let America bankrupt itself trying to win an unwinnable war. The Soviets spent a fraction of what the US spent, mostly just supplying weapons to North Vietnam. And they achieved a strategic victory. They watched as America's economy cracked, as the dollar collapsed, as social unrest tore the country apart. It was asymmetric warfare at its finest, the strong defeated by the weak, not through superior force, but through superior endurance and lower costs. The lesson of Vietnam is the same lesson that appears throughout history. Wars are easy to start, but hard to finish, and they're always more expensive than the politicians claim. When Lyndon Johnson escalated the war in 1965, he promised it would be quick and affordable. He was either lying or deluded. The war dragged on for 8 years of American combat involvement and continued for 2 more years after that. The costs spiraled beyond anyone's imagination. And the burden fell not on the politicians who made the decisions, but on the ordinary people who paid the taxes, fought the battles, and suffered the inflation. The Vietnam War also revealed the limits of American power. For the first time since the founding of the Republic, America had lost a war. It wasn't because the soldiers weren't brave or the generals weren't skilled. It was because the war was unwinnable given the political and economic constraints. The U.S. couldn't invade North Vietnam without risking a war with China. It couldn't use nuclear weapons without international condemnation. And it couldn't sustain the economic costs indefinitely without destroying its own economy. So it lost. And in losing, America learned that military power has limits. You can't bomb people into loving you. You can't win a guerrilla war in someone else's country when the population supports the guerrillas. And you can't spend your way to victory if the costs exceed the value of the objective. These lessons were learned at a terrible price, but they were forgotten a generation later when America invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. The pattern repeated: the promises of quick victory, the underestimated costs, the mission creep, the economic damage. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The final accounting of the Vietnam War is still being written. The veterans are still dying, and their benefits are still being paid. The debt incurred to finance the war is still part of the national debt, compounding with interest. The inflation unleashed in the 1970s reshaped the American economy in ways that are still felt today. The distrust of government that began with the lies about Vietnam has never fully healed. But perhaps the most enduring cost is the loss of innocence. Before Vietnam, Americans believed their country was exceptional, that it always won, that it always did the right thing. After Vietnam, that belief was shattered. The war revealed that America could be just as foolish, just as brutal and just as fallible as any other nation. It could lose wars. It could waste treasure. It could break promises. The cost of that revelation, the psychological and cultural cost, cannot be measured in dollars, but it is perhaps the heaviest burden of all. The Vietnam War didn't break America completely, but it came close. It ended the post-war boom, destroyed the dollar's gold backing, unleashed a decade of inflation and stagnation, and shattered the nation's confidence. All for a war that didn't need to be fought and couldn't be won. I'm Adam, and this is the Prime History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.